I want to acknowledge with the deepest of respect the Lekwangan peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands. And I also want to acknowledge the Sanghees, Esquimalt, and Wusanek peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Now, Professor Victor's new book, COVID-19 in Asia, couldn't be more timely. We are, of course, in the middle of a once in a 100 years pandemic that has now taken over 2 million lives. In the US alone, the number of the dead is now approaching what it was during the Spanish flu of 1918. The editor, Victor Ramraj, is a familiar name here and internationally. He is a professor of law and chair in Asia Pacific Legal Relations at the University of Victoria, where he also serves as the director of the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives. Previously, he spent 16 years at the National University of Singapore and served as co-director of the Center for Transnational Legal Studies in London. His research interests span comparative constitutional law, transnational regulation, emergency powers, and the state-company relationship. Our discussion today will begin with an overview of the book's structure and the process involved in its completion. I'm going to invite Victor to provide this overview shortly. After his presentation, we will have 5 discussants who will reflect on the book. Dr. Carol Liao, Dr. Supriya Routh, Professor Mark Gillen, Dr. Kathryn Chan, and Professor Ted McDorman. And after they are done presenting or reflecting on the sections, we are going to then open the floor to the audience, people who want to ask questions, who have comments. We're going to open the floor then. There's going to be a question box managed by, I believe John is the one managing that, and questions are going to be directed there. Okay. Very quickly, before I turn the floor over to Victor, I'm going to say a few words about the speakers so we don't have to introduce them again. I'm going to start with the first speaker, Dr. Carol Liao. She is the director of the Center for Business Law and an associate professor at the UBC Allard School of Law and the UBC Sauder Distinguished Scholar of the Dillon Center for Business Ethics at the UBC Sauder School of Business. She is also the principal co-investigator of the Canada Climate Law Initiative. Prior to academia, she was a senior lawyer at Sherman and Sterling LLP in New York. Most recently, she was a recipient of the 2021 Influential Women in Business Award from Business in Vancouver. Welcome, Carol. Dr. Supriya Routh is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Law here at the University of Victoria. His research interests are labor law, sustainable development, and post-colonialism and law. Professor Ted McDorman joined the Faculty of Law here at UVic in 1985. He has authored over 100 publications in the areas of ocean and environmental law and policy, international trade law, and comparative constitutional law. He has been a visiting professor at institutions in Thailand, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Canada, and is editor-in-chief of Ocean Development and International Law, the Journal of Marine Affairs. Dr. Kathryn Chan is an associate professor here at UVic, where she teaches and researches in the areas of nonprofit law, public law, and law and religion. She previously practiced law at a boutique charity law firm in Vancouver and completed her doctoral research on comparative charity regulation at the University of Oxford as a Trudeau Foundation scholar. Her most recent published work examines the implications of according religious institutions, religious freedom, in their own right. And last but not the least, Professor Mark Gillen has been a professor at the Faculty of Law here at UVic since 1987. His main areas of research are securities regulation, trusts, and corporate law. He has taught securities regulation in the LLM business program at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok since 1999. Welcome again to every one of you. Now, like I said, after each reader has provided their comments, we're going to welcome people to speak. But before then, I'm going to again ask Victor to take the floor in case he wants to respond to the discussants. And he will have the floor very briefly before everyone else is welcome to comment. At this time, I will now invite Victor to provide a brief overview of the book structure and the process involved in the completion of the work. Over to you now, Victor.
Thank you so much, Ire, and welcome everyone. I see that a lot of the contributors to the book are here. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for sharing your time with us this evening, this morning. Ire, it's a real honor to have you moderate this session, and thank you for pointing out the fundamental flaw in the volume, which is that your name does not appear in it, nor does your work. And you can bet that we are going to have some conversations about bringing you into the second edition. And I would take your opening remarks as an acceptance of that offer. So thank you so much, Ire. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly deviate from the task you've given me. I'm not going to say much about the structure of the book because I think that will come out in the comments. What I am going to do is to pull the curtain back a little bit on the process and tell you a little bit more of a personal story and journey that may bring you back to those early days of the pandemic. And as I was thinking about this talk and taking myself back, it's really amazing, at least for me, how difficult it is to put myself back in that place before the pandemic. But I want to just very briefly take you from Bangkok. I was teaching in Bangkok at Chulalongkorn University in January of 2020. And my mom, who I'm delighted to see has been able to join us today, I remember having a conversation with her, and she said, "Oh, you're in Bangkok. I read in the paper that there are a couple of cases of this strange virus that are showing up in Thailand." And I kind of, she's my mom. She's concerned about me, and I kind of shrugged and I said, "Oh, okay. I'll be careful, Mom." Little did I know what was going to unfold. So I got back to Victoria, and of course now news is starting to come out about the epidemic that started in Wuhan. And fast forward to the beginning of March of last year, and I found myself being whisked away in an ambulance to a hospital in Victoria. I had a high fever and I was delirious. And I spent about 2 to 3 days in the hospital under the wonderful care of a really amazing group of frontline workers. And I was tested. I think I was among the first on Vancouver Island to be tested for COVID. Turns out I was negative, but I did test positive for H1N1. And a few days later, fortunately, I was back on my feet, found myself traveling to Toronto to visit with my younger son, Satch, and my partner, Sandy, and we were visiting our son, Eli, at University of Toronto. And in those few days, we were supposed to see a basketball game. It was canceled. And we were supposed to visit Eli and head back, and turned out that he had to leave his dormitory. We very quickly packed him up, and he flew back with us to Victoria. So that was around the 18th of March. About a week later, an idea popped into my head. So that was on the 23rd of March of last year. So a year ago this week, the idea of putting together a book on COVID-19 in Asia. And again, the memories are a little bit foggy of that period. It involved a lot of walking in Victoria, on the traditional territories of the Songhees people, in my case. I came to appreciate a great deal more. I think of my colleague John Burrows when I think of this, and many of my other colleagues at UVic, and how they speak about connecting to the land. And I don't think I quite appreciated it until those days, the importance of being in nature and being connected. And it was really, as much as we were in the midst, at the beginning of an incredible pandemic, it was really an opportunity to connect to nature. So I came away with a much greater appreciation of that, and still have a long way to go. But I don't think I did it in quite the traditional way, because I often had my earbuds in, and I was involved in phone calls to many people in many different places around the world, often walking and talking, some often to the frustration of many of my eventual co-authors, because they would hear traffic whizzing by at times. But in that period, I remember that sort of sense of apprehension, and what I would describe as perhaps a compulsion. And I imagine that some of you might feel this in different contexts, but thank you, Ire, for that lovely account of my work in the past. But in those moments, it carried some weight. And I felt that, given my work on emergency powers, in collaboration with my good friend and colleague Arun Thiruvengadam, and much of my other work on transnational regulation, and my sort of cumulative experiences, I felt I had to do something. And I felt this at other points in my career, but I felt I had to do something. And I think as academics, some of us and some of you are very active. You take to the media, or you roll up your sleeves and get to work. I guess I thought the tools I had were the tools of maybe pulling people together and trying to tackle a problem that we were all facing. And I felt a compulsion, a really deep compulsion to do so. I reached out to a number of colleagues, and I think there was a kind of a feeling of like-mindedness, that we were all struggling to understand the pandemic, and the tools that we use to understand it are the tools of writing and reflection. And my sense that there was a feeling that we all wanted to do something, and we could only do it together, right? We couldn't do it on our own. This was too big for any one scholar to try to deal with. And at that point, I have to, again, thank my co-authors. And if I don't remember to, I'm going to do it now so I don't forget. I see Nicholas Picard is on the line, and he is thanked properly in the book, but I just want to say what an amazing effort Nick did. So thank you, Nicholas. But I was reaching out, yay. I was reaching out to colleagues, and I did not have a publisher, and I did not have a contract. And the colleagues I reached out to, I took a huge leap of faith in agreeing to write chapters on the very tight 6 to 8 week deadline that I gave them. And remarkably, and again, to my immense gratitude, all delivered. And we put it through a very rigorous editorial process and exchanged papers, and all of my great colleagues at CAPI helped us to workshop several of the papers. So thank you. I know many of you are in the audience, and it was really, truly a collaboration. And I'm also grateful to Jamie Barrison and his colleagues at OUP, also for taking a leap of faith on this volume and agreeing to really put it through an expedited process. So yeah, that was the process, I suppose, the personal journey, the feeling of compulsion, and the many kilometers I walked along the way, deliberately to try to deal in my own personal way with a very strange situation. So sorry, I'm going on a little long, but I just have two more points. One is the challenge writing, of addressing a moving target, right? Because it certainly was. We were at the beginning of the pandemic. It was clear that we were. And how do you write about something at the very beginning? What I discussed when we were talking about the chapters, I took a page from journalism, and journalists often speak of writing a first draft of history. And in a sense, that's what we were doing as authors at the beginning of this momentous set of events. We were trying to capture the moment, capture those early days of the pandemic. And in some ways, I'm glad we did it, because I look back and I just shake my head and think, really, I can't believe that happened. But I leave it to you and the readers to comment on that effort. The second part of what we were trying to do, in addition to trying to capture the moment, was also to tease out and identify what we expected to be the enduring themes. So not just to capture the moment, but to extrapolate a little bit from it and to anticipate what might outlast the pandemic. So that I guess there were the two sort of ideas that structured our approach to the volume. And so finally, let me just say that the other piece of this, and of course, the idea of Asia is itself a construct and it's contentious, but I guess the question is, where does Asia fit in the story, and where will it fit in the story as we look back? And there's a lot that's been written, I guess, because this month is a bit of an anniversary of sorts, and people are saying, well, there's a lot to learn from Asia. I think, in a sense, that is patently true, but I want to add a few caveats. The first is, of course, it's important to not to romanticize the response of many jurisdictions in Asia, but also to firmly recognize the diversity. And I think that's one of the things of studying a broad region, is that there's an absolutely immense, stunning diversity of legal systems, of cultures and languages and experiences and individual experiences and gendered experiences and ecological experiences. And the multiplicity is truly staggering. But at the same time, when you zoom back and you think perhaps epidemiologically, and you look at the tables, it's clear that if you take all of the jurisdictions in this book and you look at their responses and you look at the ability of all of those diverse places to deal with and contain the pandemic, they are on the whole doing a far, far better job than Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. So why is that? Well, we'll probably spend a good decade or two trying to figure that out. This book maybe points to some potential answers, not all of them. This is the beginning of a conversation. But if we were able to start that conversation, then I think in some ways we will have done what we set out to do. So thanks for attending, and I will now be quiet and leave it to you to pick things apart and tell us what we could have done better, and help me to convince Ire to join the second edition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor. Thank you. Mindful of time, I am going to move quickly to turn it over to Dr. Carol Liao. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here virtually with you all, coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And it is so fun to get to be one of the readers for this book, especially amongst so many wonderful friends that are here. It was a bit of a trip, reliving the feelings of only last year when COVID-19 descended down upon the world, and even hearing Victor recounting that too brought back these memories for me. And so how remarkable it is to have this book in front of me while we're still in the middle of it, and having this intense initial period of COVID-19 documented. And recounting what happened at and near the epicenter of it all. It really leaves me with a lot of emotions. It's like reading a science fiction novel and you're still living in, and learning about what was happening across the world at the time, right at the start. I got chills reading it. First, generally, I'll just say the depth and breadth in which this book engages with the, I'd say, panorama of issues raised from COVID-19, navigating the complexities of various governments, showcasing the richness and diversity, absolutely, of Asia, and highlighting how there's no unique or distinctive Asian approach to the pandemic, but cutting across various state and non-state actors with a comparative lens. Just the selection of chapters and contributors, the structure and comprehensiveness of the book. It was all done with such a deft hand, making this comprehensive read so compelling, and that I hope we can all learn from. And I just want to really reiterate right now at the start here my sincere congratulations to Victor and the contributors for this unforgettable and extraordinary book. It really captures a moment in history that we're never going to forget. And it is a tour de force, so congratulations. So I'm commenting on part one, the first wave containment measures, where the first three chapters in that section provide an intimate look at countries that were at the front lines of COVID-19. China, of course, Taiwan with its tenuous relationship and close economic ties to China, and Vietnam with over 1,000 kilometers of land bordering on China, and also with China as its largest trading partner. These chapters were then followed by a fascinating chapter on the spread of information versus the spread of the virus, looking at China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong during a most politically fraught time in Hong Kong's history. Then a chapter providing an intimate look at the border and entry controls across Asia, and finally, on the reactions and unprecedented measures taken by the central banks to manage this crisis. And these chapters sang together. I want to pull out some threads and thoughts I had, but I will say I learned so much and feel so privileged to get to ask questions in this forum right now on this. So first, I wanted to throw back a question that Professor Ramraj and Professor Little posed at the very start of the book, which is, what difference does it make whether a government is more or less democratic or authoritarian in its legal framework and overall political orientation? And I'd love to know what the authors think about this question, because in looking at the successes in terms of early containment from these Asian countries, it is rather fascinating thinking about this along the backdrops of China and Taiwan in particular. And each chapter in this part one references lessons learned from previous outbreaks and crises, particularly SARS. And in the chapter on central banks by Professor Hoffman, there's also reference to the global financial crisis. So those lessons from SARS, H1N1, MERS, etc., of course, were seriously tested with the epic proportions of this pandemic. The past experiences from these outbreaks in these countries, they allowed these governments to respond quickly, right? Specifically from the SARS experience, China was ready with its community policing and surveillance technology. In Taiwan, with its medical resilience and a resilient society, all too familiar with these preventative measures, immediately masking, washing hands, distancing, and Vietnam with built-in reaction plans and measures from SARS, allowing its government to introduce strict measures to prevent the spread. And this thread of governmental trust, how different that looked and what that means across an authoritarian regime versus a democratic and largely transparent government, a socialist republic, and a region in the midst of fighting for social autonomy and civic freedoms. So, a question I have too is, how have these governments maintained trust within their unique political contexts and relationships with their citizens? And how, if at all, did they fail? And how does this notion of collectivism versus individualism fit into this idea of trust? And were these regimes better situated than others where individual freedoms are prioritized? And fascinating to me, on top of those lessons learned from SARS were some of the lessons that were not learned, particularly in China regarding censorship, and how that translated into very interesting lessons from the SARS experience in Taiwan and Hong Kong regarding their trust of information coming out of China. You know, sometimes I feel like it's a moot point to press upon that story of Dr. Li Wenliang. You know, the Chinese government has issued a formal apology since, and I understand he's been martyred, you know, but it isn't about one person so much as the difference in those transparent systems versus the accounting we see in Professor Wu's chapter, where the words such as Wuhan pneumonia, unknown virus, these key words, these 45 keywords that were added to the censor list on December 31st, 2019, 2 days after doctors tried to warn the public about the virus. You know, knowing this and this research can almost cause physical pain as a reader, thinking about what could have been prevented. And so, you know, Taiwan's collective memory from SARS and their mistrust of China's information sharing allowed them to contain the virus. You know, the days when those key words were added to the censor list was the same day Taiwan implemented screenings from travelers in Wuhan. You know, so the free flow of information in Taiwan and the residual rights and freedoms in Hong Kong and their social protests allowed them to contain the virus, you know, which is a fascinating account I found. And my question is, what are those broader lessons that can be learned from this? And are the right people learning them? And also, what can the WHO learn from this? And, you know, the theme of independence and interdependence is also an interesting one from the chapter on border and entry controls. And I appreciated very much the framing of this chapter and its echoing of the tensions and exerting power by the states and the vulnerabilities of those it impacts. And the law and difference and who we include and don't include in our borders, and this notion of a new normal. I'd like to know now, upon a year of reflection and observation, what the new normal is starting to look like, and if in the long run it's going to be a good thing or not, and how, you know, it may change industries and labor, and are those vulnerable groups like migrant workers who are easily exploited in countries they work, are they going to just fare worse in this new normal? Finally, my last point is, as a business lawyer, it was really interesting to read on the central banks and their measures in reaction to a crisis comparable to the global financial crisis, yet not very comparable at all as well, which Professor Hoffman notes. And while the idea has been that jurisdictions familiar with the crisis were better prepared in that way, you know, the author notes that actually the banks were coming at the pandemic from a weakened position to begin with, as you know, liquidity supplies were already high, and liquidity is often the best weapon central banks have in their arsenal of tools. So, you know, where we are now, and are things looking better, or are we headed towards that monetary and sovereign debt crisis that is feared at the end of the chapter? And finally, I'll just end by saying, you know, we have heard COVID-19 being called a portal. The World Bank calls it the Great Reset. And so, Victor, what's your take as you reflect upon this time capsule, really, of this research from a year ago and where we are now? Well, less than a year ago, but, you know, if it is indeed a great reset, or has it only entrenched those in power more and exacerbated inequality since? And what's your outlook going forward? And if there were, and it sounds like there will be, a sequel to this book, what's it going to look like? For sure. So that's all I have to say, but I really just want to reiterate my huge congratulations on this book. It's you should be really proud, and so should your mom, and I know she is, and I am certainly proud too. Congratulations.
Thank you, Dr. Carol. I know Victor wanted to take a back seat and just listen to everyone talk, but with those questions, we're certainly going to be hearing from him again, because I'm sure he would want to respond, right? Dr. Supriya Routh, over to you.
Thank you. John told me that I can at the max take 10 to 12 minutes. I'll try to stick to that time. If I don't erase, don't hesitate to interrupt me and stop me there. Of course, thank you very much for inviting me to the celebration. And I take it as a celebration. It feels like Diwali in the midst of dark horror that we are thrust into. And I hope my attire reflects that celebratory mood that I'm in. I congratulate the editor for his wartime effort and to all the authors who wrote their chapters in the middle of an unprecedented emergency, which is the subject matter of my comment today. It was an emergency, it still is an emergency about health, economic situation, social situation, relational situation, and political situation. Uh, I'm really happy and proud to be able to comment on this book. And I feel that the editor now knows not to invite everyone to contribute to his projects. He needs to leave some people outside so that they can comment on the book when it comes out. Uh, that you all collectively produced this 460-page book, excluding the preface and the index, in a record time bears testimony of your resilience. And may I, who has nothing to do with the book, but as your colleague in the broader academia, also take pride in declaring that the pandemic may test us, but it will not beat the best inquisitive spirit in us. Tall claims, yes. But this book is indeed one for the history. It's a real-time recording of events, including human plight, not a mere recording though. It's a critical one that's mindful of what it means to be a political and social community. So I've been assigned to discuss part 2 of the book on emergency powers. It discusses the complexities involved with emergency powers. Obvious are individual liberty and public interest, but that's only the starting point of the book. It's complex, nuanced, and offers a diverse account from different jurisdictions. So emergency, when I read this section, part 2, I understood emergency as a serious, unexpected, and often dangerous situation requiring immediate action. The challenge, therefore, is to what extent that action could be curbed or should be allowed to go on in view of that urgent situation. Uh, the rich set of chapters engaging with a range of sub-themes on governance offers us a varied view. They talk about varied governmental approaches and their responses. And each of the chapters took a normative position that should inform future policies. The positions taken are varied. For example, Tremblay and George's concern is the increasing centralization of power in the government of India. Leela Patana and Tankavorn worry about the paternalistic nationalism of the Thai approach that sacrifices individual liberties and stigmatizes critique and protest. Ono and Matsui caution that calls for centralization of emergency power in Japan should be mindful of the historical abuses of emergency power in Japan and the lure of authoritarianism abroad. Emergency power should not be used to curb freedom to criticize the government. Ramraj and Thiruvengadam warn against the permanence of temporary on our way to returning to normal, and note the role of expertise in preparing for the next emergency. Chua and Gary Lee acknowledge the necessity of the Singaporean government's approach to governing through contagion. It's another way of conceiving of emergency governance, but want us to remember its wretchedness in its mightiest moment of victory. And I think that caution rings very well with all of us. And that caution permeates through all the other chapters in this part. these were mere glimpses of these fantastic chapters in part 2. As you could see, it's difficult for me to capture the nuances offered in each one of these chapters in 10 minutes. All of these chapters require a deep and critical engagement. I invite all to carefully read this author's work as it is articulated in this book, and also its relationship to the other chapters in the different other parts of the book. As congratulatory as I am, however, as a trained academic, I cannot bear happy endings. And the editors and authors of the book may allege non-seriousness against me if I had no difficult question or critical comments to offer. Thus, what I missed, and I acknowledge that that might not have been the intention of the authors or the editors to bring in these perspectives, but what I missed was an analysis of private actors, which I did not find in this part of the book, except for sporadic references, including businesses and regulation by businesses. In discussions of emergency, should we think about law and policy made or modified by corporations, including financial corporations, market regulators, and trade unions? How important those policies and rules and regulations are in shaping our way of life during an emergency. The second aspect wherein I thought I needed to know more is in the discussion about the role of experts. Should we also question or investigate whose expert is it? Pandemic is not only a public health problem in the narrow sense of the term. So we are not thinking only in terms of contagion. It's also about economic survival for a range of actors. For example, informal workers in Asia, global supply chains, and as Carol noted earlier, migrant workers. Should expert opinion be taken on its face value? Or could the public feedback that Ramraj and Thiruvengadam noted in their chapter challenge such opinion from the point of view of their lived experiences? Where exactly we strike this balance between expert and people's actual contextual lived experiences? And in making law during emergency or in invoking law and legal powers during emergency, to what extent government should engage the population in the discursive dialogue process during the lawmaking process or law modification process that might or might not go on to sideline experts. But I must also acknowledge here that with my earlier personal interaction with the editor, whom I happen to know closely, my understanding was that he is strongly supportive of expert opinion in legal policy making. But I'll have to say that after reading his co-authored chapter, I am much more relieved to know that he is much closer to what I think ought to be the role of government and the parliament than I earlier assumed. With those comments, I'll bring my comments to conclusion, and I look forward to any responses that authors or the editor might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Supriya. Thank you. I actually started out myself with the part 2, and I was really fascinated by some of the chapters there, especially Chua and Lee's interplay, just opposing the strength of the apparatus, government apparatus in the exercise of emergency powers, and to borrow Supriya's words, the wretchedness of the system and the injustice that it was, that it does to many members of the society. I think that was a very fascinating read, and I encourage everyone to read that chapter. I'm going to turn it over to Ted right now. Ted McDorman, you are next. Unmute. You will have to unmute.
Technology, science, and expertise. whatever else I've accomplished in my career, I have accomplished none of these three. I do not understand technology. I could not even unmute myself. I failed science in high school, which would explain why I ended up wherever I ended up. And expertise is highly, highly questionable, to put it slightly. So I am perfectly positioned to comment on these chapters. And all I'm going to do is give you a little bit of a highlight, I suppose, or a little bit of a feel for what I saw in the 5 different chapters. I am, of course, duty bound and required to start with the first chapter, given the fact that the dean of the law school is one of the co-authors. So I have to say nice things right away, that yes, it's very interesting. The overall chapters, let's go back for a second. The chapters are interesting because you have 3 that are basically country related. You have Singapore, South Korea, and Hong Kong. And then you have 2 that are much, I would say, a little bit more general. I do have a comment while I think of it, Victor, and there's probably a really good answer to this, but when I was looking through all of the countries, the country that I missed was Indonesia. And I don't say this as a criticism, I just say this as an observation that Indonesia is the 2nd largest populated country on earth, as far as I remember, or certainly in Asia. And so there's probably a good reason, but I am curious that Indonesia kind of probably just for different reasons, but I just point out that I noticed. That's all I want to say about that. Chapter 13, which was Dr. Bro's piece with 2 authors, was about the World Health Organization. Not an institution that I have a lot of familiarity with when it gets ranked down to it. It's very interesting message, though, is if in the early days of COVID, that in March of last year, that if you paid attention to what the WHO was telling you, the countries that paid attention, at least in Asia, did really well. Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong were basically largely, I'm going to say compliant, but they basically followed the direction of what the World Health Organization was giving. And they survived quite well. Other countries, and I should include Vietnam in that as well. Other countries who did not pay attention to what the World Health Organization was saying was a bit more problematic for them in one form or another. So it is at least from the analysis in Dr. Bro's piece, that the WHO has played and could play and did play for some countries a really important role. A lot of, so it went well in terms of for some of those countries. Other countries that were not sort of paying attention to the World Health Organization or opted not to for whatever reason. So that's an interesting message. The conclusion of the chapter I find a bit curious, just because it's curious, okay? It recommends a stronger WHO. And it depends on what that means in terms of what do you mean by a stronger World Health Organization. And the impression I have, and I suspect that Dr. Bro would not agree with me, which is great, that what the idea is that the World Health Organization should have more kind of law-ish type power and authority. And I actually not so opposed to that. I am concerned about that. And I just don't see states giving up any authority to close a border in terms of giving up, okay, WHO say we have, look at my phrase, we have to, as a matter of international law, close the border. I just don't think that's the type of authority that a state is ever going to give to an international body. And particularly something as political, more so than legal, than the WHO. But it is a very interesting chapter on the World Health Organization. And I was thirsting for a little bit more information. That just was, there was lots there, and I just was curious about, because I don't know enough about the WHO. But I thought the conclusion of more WHO was positive in one sense because they had success, but also I'm just not sure how realistic that is in terms of what countries want to control themselves in the real world scenario. Anyhow, it was an interesting chapter. The chapter I read first, in fact, so first that I thought I was going to be able to choose the chapters that I wanted to comment on. But the chapter was the personal interest was the South Korea chapter. I've been spending time in South Korea over the last number of years, so I've spent some time looking at history, South Korea has done well, if that's the right phraseology, in terms of the COVID. The chapter is quite deep, I think. It is, well, it is deep. It either is, there isn't. It's about surveillance and the idea of, being able to do contact, to look into people's lives, to help them, admittedly, but basically to investigate, and the challenge of privacy. And the general issue of privacy is that, how far should you be able, even in a pandemic, how far should you be able to reach into people's lives in one form or another? Now, I am exceptionally biased on this question because I do guard with degrees of reason my own personal privacy for a whole variety of odd reasons. But I have kind of a point of view on that, I suppose. Privacy generally, and then of course the conflict of that with democratic governance is sort of difficult. How do you deal with privacy and how do you deal with the pandemic? The last line of the chapter, I did read the whole chapter, but I stick to the last line, right? Democratic governments in a new normal must be built not on individual freedom and rights, but on interconnected freedom and solidarity. What a great line. What does it mean? Is it to be a little blunt, because I'm known to do that a little bit, is this brilliant or is this a cop-out in terms of, okay, we just don't know? And I'm just not sure. And, I don't know where that balance is either. And I'm not surprised that the authors don't know. But I wonder about that. I also wonder a little bit about privacy generally, and just in the common parlance we have now. Privacy and human rights, which I put together as a human right, is really different, I think, for generationally. Not to get into generational stuff, but when we see the whole world of internet that's exploded, is there any privacy left? Do people want privacy? That's an interesting and not particularly pertinent comment. There is another chapter, chapter 14, which talks about privacy again in a slightly different context. This chapter 14 is very, very specific to the COVID situation and the idea of privacy and crisis, and privacy in terms of we understand that this is an emergency. I love the title of this. I rephrase that. I love titles of chapters or books that have questions, and I'll tell you why in a second. But can technology and privacy coexist? I love the question, because all you have to do is go to the conclusion to read the answer. And the answer here is actually, essentially, is do the best you can. Again, I'm not sure that, given the nature of the issues at stake, I get the do, and keep in mind that this chapter 14 is very, very specific on the realities of the pandemic on a day-to-day. If you're in a crisis, how do you deal with privacy? And I'm being a little bit flippant, do the best you can. But I think in a crisis with privacy, maybe that is the best answer. And that focus of that chapter was quite brilliant, but quite, I would say, a little bit narrower than the Korean one, which is a lot more about policy more generally. And the question that we would ask, of course, is, well, what will come next? Are we into a scenario where privacy is going to be limited as a new norm in terms of what's come out of COVID? And one of the chapters would probably say no, and I think that's the ones with the expertise, do the best you can, whereas I think the other chapter doesn't answer and was not asked to answer that. but I think it does raise for all of us a really serious and really interesting issue. My other comments are quite limited, to be fair. The Hong Kong chapter, which is, you know, the sensitivity of politics in a pandemic between Hong Kong and the People's Republic of China. I missed the strike, I guess. I was unaware that there had been a strike in Hong Kong of hospital workers. You know, I see that Carol's saying, where was I? Well, it's hard to tell. Remember that not being always on internet stuff? But that was very interesting. And the strike was all built around the idea that Hong Kong, or at least the strikers, these were the professional staff in hospitals and doctors, did not, you know, wanted to block as much as they could people coming from China, potentially infected, coming into Hong Kong. Now, given the political realities of Hong Kong, which I am a little more sensitive of, the concern was the risk of being overwhelmed. And I think the chapter captures that. What the and my guess wasn't clear is just how that fit into the political reality of what's going on with Hong Kong today, and how much, whether there was a real benefit to that strike or just whether it's just a sign of frustration. It's private actors, so there's that sort of commentary that someone commented on that. I thought the chapter is a bit new to me, but it was in terms of some of the subject matter, but the sensitivity of the politics between Hong Kong and China, which at least the way I understand it now is sort of switched right heavily to China. But it was an interesting chapter. I don't have a question per se. Singapore, those of us who are familiar with Singapore, and while I don't have the familiarity as Victor, of course, because I've never lived there, but those of us who have done a modicum of Asian work, even if it was 20 years ago, Singapore, you know, as a technocracy, hard to say, harder to spell, technocracy and transition. We would expect Singapore to do exactly what Singapore did, which was be a leader in terms of fighting COVID. It was, you know, had the strategies were there to do the government working well, the health system working well. We would expect that. The chapter is organized in the way that I think makes sense in a very much way. That it's structured around what we would most of us who've done some Singapore work recognize as the two main things. And one is that a technocratic, expedient, professional government, and governing, it's not perfect all the time, but it is that real professional government you get in Singapore. And also the idea of social cohesion, that would be a major part of what Singapore was trying to do. And again, if you know a little bit about Singapore, it is not ethnically, racially cohesive in that sense. And Singapore government is massively sensitive to those kinds of issues. And I think this chapter captured that, you know, in a way that was really really good, and brought, you know, and that's what Singapore accomplished. And Singapore of course, is a city-state with a smaller environment, has some advantages in terms of larger states with, you know, more diverse populations. But it's not surprising that Singapore has done well, my understanding, in the COVID scenario. Although I was looking at numbers a couple of hours ago, and I noticed that Singapore was up slightly in sort of deaths per million, which they had been down around 1 or 3, and I think today they were up at 5, which is probably quite shocking in Singapore. Anyhow, thank you very much for the opportunity to look through and read and go back in time, in my case, to some knowledge that I used to have about Southeast Asia. Good.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you very, very much. I've just been chatting with John and in the question box, and we're very mindful of time. So over to you, Kathryn.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Victor, for the invitation and the opportunity to read this book or parts of this book. I hope to read the whole thing eventually. And I will just reiterate much of what Carol and the others have said about the feat that you accomplished in such a way at such a challenging time. The section that I read, or the part I read, was part 4. It's on politics, religion, and governance. There's actually 7 chapters in part 4, and they cover a wide array of countries: Cambodia, Bhutan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. And given the time, I'm not going to go into each of these chapters separately. What I've chosen to do instead is just to identify 3 themes that I think came across strongly to me as maybe what Victor called early on enduring themes that I think are worthy of further study and consideration, and a bit more depth, right, further on into the crisis. I'll just say, you know, that again, as others have said, the first thing that hit me was really the diversity that was apparent between the countries represented by these chapters. In size, and particularly in population, right? When you're comparing governance responses, right? Bhutan only has 750,000 people or so, I think, right? Versus Indonesia with 240 million. It's hard to, or you have to think about those things when you're comparing the responses, obviously. But nonetheless, I think there were a number of cross-cutting themes, and I'll just quickly identify 3. One, I think many of the authors, almost all the authors, expressed a concern about the increase in executive power, or the transfer of power over to the executive quite quickly during the time of the pandemic. You know, in Cambodia, part of the issue seems to be that it's quite burdensome to pass new laws, and so many COVID laws and policies came from the executive, things including the banning of foreign visitors, regulating prices, the flow of necessary goods, right? We see a similar thing in Indonesia. We see a similar thing apparently in Malaysia. Where government starts offering payments to individual workers, right, without many of these packages and measures going through government. And even in Bhutan, where the authors seem to be more positive about the government's response in general to the pandemic, there's a note that the courts, the Supreme Court ordered all of the lower courts to cancel bail for persons on request of the police during this period. Okay, so even there, this kind of concern. And so, you know, the questions that are raised are, you know, this is a point in time analysis. Has it actually become worse? Have these structures been entrenched, or was this a temporary thing? The other element that I think would be worthy of further study is, you know, this isn't the only crisis where we've seen increases in executive power, but I think the particular or the specific peculiar thing or particular thing about the pandemic in some ways was that people were stuck in their homes, as we all know. And so there was really a widespread kind of privatization or domesticization. I don't know, I felt it personally, this sense that important decisions were being made, and even people who were normally in public discourse were kind of stuck in their homes, and besides engaging online, kind of not in the debate, so to speak, right? And of course, this is a thing that hasn't played out evenly in terms of gender, right? So I think that there's an analysis to be done there about with a little more consideration of gender identity, and perhaps Asian women and how they may have been affected or isolated by the way that power was exercised differently during the pandemic. A second theme that I think emerged strongly for me was a theme about the relationship between constitutional structure and institutions, or perhaps how power was played out, and individual leadership or individual integrity. So and a sense about, you know, the interaction of those two things, the structural and institutional norms, and the particular personalities that were in power at this moment in time was quite important. And so, for example, you know, in Indonesia, the authors Hosen and Hamado suggest that the government's response was ineffective, and that ineffectiveness was related in large measure to, for example, the unhealthy relationship between the Minister of Health Affairs and the Indonesian Medical Association, that it was intimately related to the political rivalry between Jokowi and his administration and the governor of Jakarta, right? And then you get that for me, that was really juxtaposed against the story that was told about Bhutan and the role that the king played there, and the impact that was made by that really strong leadership. You know, and the authors talk about how all Bhutanese kings have been an example of what they call servant leadership, right? Which is in itself kind of an idea with very religious undertones, which is a point I'll get to next. You know, that they led their own military operations, right, well into modern times. So, you know, obviously those are countries of very different sizes, and that makes a difference, right? But I do think there's a story to be told, a story that's emerging about the importance of particular personalities and people at you know, particular moments in time. And then finally, I think for me, many of the chapters communicated that religious traditions contain normative resources that were useful in addressing the pandemic, and that might be useful in other crises that are facing the world. And of course, you know, Asia is a really interesting context to think about this this theme, because Asia, as some of the authors note, is home of all of the major world religions. And so there are acknowledgements of the problems caused by some religious communities and leaders, that they cause some of the biggest spikes of infections at various points in time through not following advice on mass gatherings, for example, and other things. But they also developed a lot of diverse and really interesting responses to combat the virus, right? There's talk about or discussion of Buddhist communities that made masks. There's a discussion of Catholic priests flying in helicopters over cities and sprinkling holy water and intoning prayer. And my favorite, one community that actually dressed children up as ghosts to help frighten people into staying in their homes. Something that I think they might have tried here if they had thought of it. And so I think there's a really rich conversation to be had there. And it's not just kind of the interesting things and diverse things that they did to contest the response, but that that there have been internal discussions within religious traditions about how to understand their own doctrines in light of the way that the world has changed and in light of this crisis. And Chantal and Jai Talaki discuss this really, the debates that have arisen, and I'll just end with this, over the usefulness of Buddhist teachings in Sri Lanka, I think, as a way of responding to COVID-19. And at a certain point, they quote a senior monk from Kandy who talks about the fundamental teaching of Buddhism is to live by restraining the body, and how, today's people's bodies are completely unrestrained, and that Buddhism can teach us some of the things that we need to respond to a health crisis like the present one. And in the chapter on Bhutan, there's the authors Dorji and Sharing discuss how the chief abbot of the central monastic body in that country frames the quarantine actually as an opportunity, right? As an opportunity to practice Buddhist teachings, he says, as people were otherwise too busy, right? So lots of interesting and thick religious and normative traditions. It was the impression I was left with in many of these countries that I'd love to know more about, and that I think can contribute to all the kind of set of tools that we'll need to respond to this crisis going forward. So thanks again, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kathryn. Over to you, Mark. Kindly unmute.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you, Ray. And I'm going to ask John at the beginning whether he could make me a co-host so I can share a screen, if that's possible.
Yes, of course. Just a moment.
Okay. And while you're doing that, I've got a book that I pulled off my shelf, and I brought this book down, just thinking of it now, as the kudos to Victor. And I'm going to speak on behalf of Douglas Johnson, trying to get a book like this together, and the difficulties that he had with this book, like herding cats, he said. And you did it in such a short space of time. So I think Doug is looking down and saying, oh my gosh, how did you do that, Victor? So I start with that. And then the other thing that I thought I would start with is, I think, we all know that so many instances around the world where pandemics have caused major disruption, major social change. And in fact, the Black Death is mentioned in one of the articles in this part 5. One of the things that I've been doing in recent years is doing a legal history course, and in the context of that, dealing with the Black Death in England and the consequences that it brought upon the society and the major social changes that it led to, which led to all kinds of changes in the law. And this one is, in the chapters that I was looking at, of course, they're doing written early on in the pandemic, and they're doing prognostication about what the effects of the pandemic will be going forward. And of course, I suppose the second edition of this is going to be the one that looks back and says, what were the effects of the pandemic, or at least a possible model for it? What were the effects of the pandemic? So I've got a share screen. I'm going to put up screen 2. Good. So my attempt to go through the articles and give you some idea of them, watch the time here. I read them sequentially, and then I got to the last one here, and I've just put this one first because all through this book, it's got so many connections from this pandemic to so many things in many ways. And here it's on the economy and the climate and sustainability. And I just found, for me, this last article here, Southeast Asian Workers in a Just-in-Time Pandemic, by Helen Lansdowne and James Lawson, just in its own way, it highlighted so many linkages. Although its focus was mainly on migrant labor, it just highlighted so many of the linkages in the pandemic. And then I started to think in terms of all the linkages that the other ones provided. So this Asian trade and supply chain linkages was sort of the next one, Dan Turiak and Philip Calvert, that came to my mind on this. And it was looking at supply chain linkages and changes that it says were already starting to happen in light of trade disputes, where businesses were looking to diversify their sources of supply. So they're, maybe losing some economies of scale in that, but feeling that it was better to diversify your sources of supply. And they went on to talk about, in terms of the prognostication about what the pandemic may mean, is its consequences for a rule-based multilateral trade system, and really sort of a potential move to a greater degree of protectionism. And then from there, my mind also went to this one, having read them, and I went back and started to think about this environment one, reset or revert in the new climate normal. Ramraj Singh, Gale, and Louise Burrows, if I'm pronouncing those names correctly. So the link was the focus on the environment, but especially they were looking at the role of export credit agencies in promoting coal-fired electricity. So that was the electric generation plants, and that was their focus. And their question really was, would COVID-19 be an opportunity for an environmental reset? That is, let's look at this opportunity that we've seen, some blue skies and things like that. What could the world be? And could we move down that better direction? Or would there instead be a reversion with governments keen to reboot their economy and feeling cash strapped and so on? And so they might let some things go on the environment. And then we have the first one in the set is governments and business, Tan Chung Han and Jiang Yu Wang. And this paper I linked to, I call the JIT paper, is the just-in-time economy paper, the one just-in-time pandemic, just-in-time economy in a pandemic. Because they of course, they do talk about the response that a number of governments did to support persons who lost their jobs, but it canvassed all kinds of other economic support. And the question when they looked at that was whether this would be a playbook for economic shock responses. And I think Victor started with the notion about how these Asian countries seem to have done well, and hopefully countries will be able to share their playbooks and think about what might work better the next time we have an economic shock, or indeed, unfortunately, the next time we might have a pandemic. And then in this paper here, Nationalism, Consolidation, Rationalization in the Aviation Industry, Jae-Woon Lee and Michelle Dai, there's a look, of course, at the airline industry and the government responses, both short term, so some of the things that they've already done, and what they might do in the long term. And then potential other responses in the industry itself about consolidation and rationalization. And much like the supply linkages paper, it said these pressures were already going on, but COVID-19 has sort of brought them to the fore much more quickly. And the concern there, well, basically the way they describe it is that we've had in Asia 20 years of liberalization, globalization, what was the other word they used? Anyway, sort of a move to freer markets in the aviation industry, but they sort of see a return to more government control and related to that, protectionism. The idea that once the government's got an equity position in the airline industry to protect their investment, they will start to do protectionist things with respect to the airline industry. And then, you know, the Mongolia one was a bit different. In a way, that's a really interesting paper to read, I found. And in this one, I think the thing at that particular point in the pandemic in this paper is that Mongolia had done very well in the pandemic, and for a number of reasons, which they articulate, some of them fortuitous for them, that they did very well from the health perspective, but from the economic perspective, no. And the difficulty, given that the book is about policy context, law and policy context, the difficulty that they were looking at was how the pandemic appears to have, at least temporarily, derailed the attempt in Mongolia to reduce its dependence on China. And in fact, it's sort of driven it more towards greater dependence on China. And this Southeast Asia, getting back to this paper on the Southeast Asian workers in a just-in-time pandemic, it's looking at this sort of just-in-time economy. So it kind of links, that's why the supply chain linkage, because it's looking at this supply chain and the various linkages there, and on migrant labor. And this one takes Asia into many other countries with the migrant labor. And then I got to the line at the end, thinking globally and concretely to optimize responses. So kind of leave that there. And then my thoughts on that. So I got a bit of time left. So on my thoughts, I began to think, particularly it was the aviation or the airline industry article, that I was starting to think, oh, why do we subsidize airlines? just the kind of question I ask. So I think I have a line in here, yes, for my notes. It was that paper that caused me to think in terms of the kind of thinking I was imbued with in one of my undergraduate degrees, which happened to be a BA in economics. I took about 3 undergraduate degrees before I decided to do something with my life. I say I was imbued with, or was I indoctrinated? So bear with me while I say that I sometimes think in that way, and I think of market failure and why should governments intervene? The notion of market failure, and I'm not going to go through possible market failures and all of these things, but I think it's perhaps in this pandemic an opportunity for governments, perhaps wanting to rethink some of the market failure, and the airline industry is one of them. And I'm not in that going to say that I think airlines should be liberalized and it's a free market in the skies. Indeed, in all of the things that I look at here, I can see really good reasons for government intervention from an economics market failure perspective. Even the Southeast Asian workers one, because at least in my idea of a societal utility function, to put it in that very odd wording of economists, I think the notion of a just and equitable distribution of wealth is a very important part of that. And so helping people who've lost their jobs or otherwise struggling is got to be high on the list of things you've got to do. You know, in the aviation industry, does one bail out market failure arguments? I don't know about market failures and that, but I'm thinking there's a lot of things where, you know, a transportation infrastructure strikes me, there's probably a lot of public good arguments there. That is something that may make sense to some extent to be actually subsidizing, because you get the benefits of linking all of these different places. I think in Canada is an interesting example in the pandemic, and I'm sure this has happened elsewhere. There's a news article on that this morning, actually, or last night. But a number of airports have just shut down, and communities aren't being serviced, or at least not serviced as well in terms of the airline. And the coal industry from a market failure. Now, this one I'll link to the politics and watching the time here. That one, the authors assert, and I think it's probably true, renewable energy costs are falling, and they're less than coal. And yet we have countries that, like China being particularly labeled, but Japan, South Korea were also noted in there, that are still promoting the construction of coal-fired plants and subsidizing coal-fired plants outside their own country. So they're exporting their technology with export credit agencies supporting that. And that's one where I kind of think, whoa, really? What's going on there? And so where I said that I think globally here, which has still got the share screen on, the thinking globally and concurrently to optimize responses, I was thinking more in terms of regional cooperation. Global cooperation, it strikes me, is very hard to get. You've got so many different interest groups and at least at a regional level, it's still very complex, but it might not be as complex. And in the Canadian context, I thought, gee, one regional solution might be Canada, which seems odd, but you know, here we are in a federal country, and maybe some federal provincial cooperation on a better scale might be kind of helpful in the Canadian context. Southeast Asia, I just wonder whether, you know, and in terms of market failure, there's a risk there, and sometimes markets can respond to risk and correct it, but risk is not something we like, I think, as human beings, you know, so can we minimize or reduce this risk? The playbook, a better playbook to respond to those kinds of things. My discomfort in all of that is the politics of all of this. That's where the environment paper really troubles me. What's going on in the politics of this? That these countries would be supporting with export credit agencies, the moving of building of coal-fired plants in these other countries. It just strikes me that something is flawed in the politics going on there, and the dangers, of course, of some of that, and just the difficulties of cooperation even on a regional level, let alone the global level, particularly from an economics perspective. We watched early in the pandemic the problems with PPE, and now we're watching the problems with the vaccine. Can you actually get cooperation from countries? And when push comes to shove, will they actually cooperate when we get our next pandemic? Anyway, time, and I will leave it there. And thank you very much, Ire and Victor.